What's up, sons? It's Blind Rod with Tech once again. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Gigabyte Aorus RX 580 8GB model, and we're going to be taking a little bit different of a viewpoint here for the RX 580 review, and we're going to check out how it performs in some of the titles where Nvidia has been winning as of recently. So these are going to be later titles and titles where the GTX 1066 GB has been beating the RX 480 8GB in my recent tests. Now, the reason I wanted to do this was to see if the RX 580 is a reason to maybe purchase a AMD card over an Nvidia card right now on some of the later titles, so stick around. This card is humongous. I'm just going to tell you right off the bat that you guys are looking at needing quite a bit of case room, especially in height, as it does go past that dual slot height with its shroud, so you want to be careful there. And I'm not too impressed with the build quality. The plastic is pretty flimsy. I've seen this on some other Gigabyte cards as well. I think that there are better options, even if you look at, for example, the MSI RX 480 here, the Gaming X edition, which they didn't change much on the 580 version. The shroud has a thicker plastic that doesn't feel near as creaky. Another big note about that is you'll also notice that the MSI card has no fan cables running on the outside of the shroud, while on the Gigabyte, unfortunately, it has this cable, this fan cable, that just sticks out, and no matter how you try to hide it, you can't. So that sucks. The good news about this cooler, though, is that it is active with 3 separate heat sinks, so you're getting your VRMs cooled, etc., etc. So that's a positive there. You do only have 2 fans, not 3 fans, like we've seen on some of their other Aorus editions for the 1080s and 1070s. You get a nice back plate. It's black with the Aorus symbol, and then a cover for the chip itself for the back of the chip there. So that's neat. On the display ports, or I guess outputs, I should say, you're going to be looking at 3 DisplayPort 1.4 ports with a single HDMI 2.0B and a single DVI-D out. So all of the connectivity you could ever possibly want in this day and age, I should say. And so you're good there. The cooler is definitely beefy, but let's talk about why it doesn't perform, or why we need that cooler. Because this card, right out of the box, all the tests are going to be in what I would consider basically just stock out of the box settings. And with those out of the box settings, we're reporting 200 watts of power consumption. This is because the card actually does sport an 8-pin and an additional 6-pin PCI power, which means you're looking at a shit ton of power. And if you're thinking about overclocking this card and turning that power limit up, you want to keep in mind that that limit's going to go even higher, where the Afterburner is going to put you, for example, let's use Afterburner, a plus 50% on power. You're going to be looking at possibly going all the way up to 300 watts of power draw, which means, yeah, you're just going to want to be super cognizant of that. You're looking at no less than 750 watts on a recommended power supply, in my personal opinion, especially if you're talking about overclocking. But as I mentioned, the cooler is super beefy, and to prove that, let's go ahead and talk about the stock temperatures, which only ended up maxing out at 72 degrees C, and this was during an extensive Fire Strike and Time Spy stress test, which I ran back to back. Now, during that time, surprisingly enough, or not surprisingly enough, because like I said, the cooling solution is really good, we were only looking at a fan speed of 42%. This 42% only pushed the fans to a 1551 fan speed and was nearly inaudible, as you can see here in our noise test, which I will run for you guys now. Be sure to pay attention to when to turn the volume up and when to turn it back down. We will be going over a 40%, a 60%, an 80%, and 100% fan speed usage at this time. Alrighty, so that's finished up. A couple of other fun notes is that the card does run at 1425 megahertz out of the box, and you're looking at a standard 2000 megahertz memory clock. Now, before you guys get all poopy about the benchmarks I'm going to show, let me clarify that I did intentionally pick games where the GTX 1066 Gigabyte was winning against the RX 488 Gigabyte. And in these situations that I've seen so far, most of the time it was such a large disparity that I didn't really expect the RX 580 to win. But it's more about how much closer does it get you if you're looking at purchasing one of these over, let's say, a 1066 Gigabyte, and if you're okay in taking those performance hits in certain games that have been releasing where Nvidia has the stronghold. The first title is going to be Mass Effect Andromeda, which has had a lot of controversy surrounding it for its awesome lip sync technology. And with that, we did see a pretty good bump going from the 580, or going from the 480 to the 580, where we saw mins go from 48 to 51, with averages getting us above a 60 FPS average from the RX 480, which was hitting an average of about 57, and a max of 73. But the big thing here is that, yes, you're getting a 1080p maxed out gameplay experience in Mass Effect Andromeda and staying above 60 FPS with your average frame rates. And it's so close on the min to the 1060 super clocked that it is within margin of error, meaning that it's safe to say that for Mass Effect Andromeda, AMD has made some massive strides with the 580, and we see about, while only a 3 to 5% improvement in FPS over the 480, it's enough to make it super relevant when comparing it to the Nvidia GTX 1066 Gigabyte. The next game is Outlast II at 1080p with max settings, where we do see quite a bit of an improvement in FPS. We're talking about a 10% change or a 10% increase over the RX 480 when moving to the RX 580, where we went and saw average frame rates go from 100 FPS to 110 FPS, with minimums bumping up only a couple FPS to 87, and our maxes hitting 130 compared to the 119 on the RX 480. This, however, is still falling short quite a bit to the EVGA GTX 1066 Gigabyte, but it is a good improvement, and it shows that you should still have a pretty good gaming experience, at least at 1080p, on the RX 580. Not that it was bad at all already on the RX 480. And then this game is kind of a controversial one, at least in my opinion, because when we saw the game boot up, it showed us that it was supporting not only Ryzen, but also AMD's Radeon graphics. And I really fully expected the RX 580 and the 480 to beat out the GTX 1060. In my initial test, this was proven not to be true, where the GTX 1066 Gigabyte did beat the RX 480. But does it beat the RX 580? And unfortunately, the answer to that question is yes. We see almost the exact same performance increases that we saw in Outlast 2 in Prey, where the RX 480 had an average of 102, while the RX 580 bumped us up to about 110 FPS, and the min frame rate went from a 71 to a 75. This doesn't even get close to the 1066 Gigabyte, especially if you take into account the 120 Hertz refresh rate panels, where it would still be recommended that you would want to pick up the GTX 1066 Gigabyte for Prey in that situation. Finally, I tested out the Surge, which I have had mixed results, or not mixed results, I've seen mixed results between the GTX 1066 Gigabyte winning and the RX 480 or 580 winning. In my personal tests, after all of the due diligence with running these tests multiple times, at least 3 times per card, outside of the outside of the RX 580, because at that point I was kind of like, wow, that's so close to the 480, it's kind of irrelevant. Where in this case for the Surge, the RX 480 and the RX 580 perform pretty much identically. We're talking almost identical with a min of 63 for both of them, an average of 72 on the 480 and 73 on the 580, and a max of only 91, so going up 1 FPS on the 580. I did want to mention though that with the 60 to 80 range or 60 to 90 range, it does seem to play smoother on the RX series cards. The only issue that we have there really right now is drivers, where the Wickle driver does seem to have some lighting issues where it causes some purple effects on a lot of the shadows and whatever ambient lighting is going on there. That's a big bummer right now. It means you're going to want to be running the non-Wickle 17.5.2 or .1 depending on, you know, when you watch this video. So actually 17.5.2 is out. My bad. There you go. So that kind of wraps up my benchmarks, and final thoughts on that is that obviously if you're going to be buying a Radeon card right now and you're debating between the 480 and the 580, the answer is obvious. You're going to be picking up the 580. Now it is going to be winning even more versus the GTX 1060 in the games where it was beating it in. I think the things of note here is that some of the bigger titles that I would mention, obviously, or the biggest title out of these that I tested that I would mention would be Mass Effect Andromeda, where we saw a serious performance increase from the RX 480 to the RX 580, and we saw it starting to trade blows directly with the GTX 1060 6GB, which I think is a pretty notable, awesome thing, and I think that shows that we do have quite a bit more horsepower, and it is making up a difference between the 480 and the 1060, at least on newer titles. I wanted to separate the next video into all of the overclocking, so I'm going to be spending some time with the card overclocking it, playing with power profiles, playing with voltages, maybe even playing with some different BIOS options and flashing, because you guys know I like to live on the edge with flashing and delidding, but I do want to go ahead and take a look at all of that probably in a single video. That's where you'll see the overclocking, and we'll see if that helps to catch up even more to the GTX 1060 6GB. Hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you guys think about the RX 580 in general, and maybe even specifically what you guys think about the Gigabyte Aorus trim of this model, where you are looking at a pretty hefty price tag for an RX 480. I think it's around $289, and if you think it's really worth the bump up from something like one of their base Gigabyte RX 4 or 580s. Blah! Now that I've stumbled all the way through that, be sure to check out my Patreon at patreon.com/sonofatech. Stay tuned to the channel for my Rime performance charts, which we'll be taking a look at here shortly, as well as Dreadnought performance tests. I do also want to take a look at the minimum specs for Far Cry 5, so definitely stay tuned for that one. And as always, I will see you next Tuesday.